Before I introduce our speaker this evening, I want to thank, first of all, the College of Arts and Sciences for their continued support of the Foley Institute and also for supporting our lecture series. The Foley Institute, for those of you who don't know about us, we were established here in 1995 to honor the service of Thomas S. Foley, who was the representative in the 5th Congressional District, which represents Pullman, for over 30 years. He was the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives and also a former ambassador to Japan, the U.S. ambassador to Japan. The institute that bears Mr. Foley's name continues his legacy of distinguished public service through a variety of programs aimed at educating the public about democracy and democratic institutions and encouraging young people to pursue careers in public service. We do a lot of exciting things here. If you want to know more about Foley Institute programs, I encourage you to like us on Facebook, send us an email. We'll send you more information about our upcoming programs. The Distinguished Lecture Series recognizes Mr. Foley's belief that critical challenges of the 21st century can only be met through innovative thinking and informed civil dialogue. Some of our previous distinguished lecturers have included luminaries such as the former Governor of Vermont and Democratic National Committee Chair Howard Dean, New York Times journalist Nicholas Kristof, U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft, NAACP President Kwasi Mfume, billionaire entrepreneur and political activist Nick Hanauer, as well as political scholars such as Morris Friarina from Stanford, Theda Skocpol from Harvard, and accomplished writers and social commentators like Christopher Hitchens and Christopher Hedges. Tonight's distinguished lectures comes at a particularly important time in global efforts to combat climate change. There can be no doubt about the science of climate change and the role that carbon pollution plays in it at this point. The question now, however, is whether we will respond and how we will respond. And on these issues, there remains deep political divisions. Policy experts agree that one of the most promising ways to address the crisis is to use market-based incentives to reduce carbon emissions through some form of carbon pricing or carbon taxes. Yet to date, efforts to adopt such policies have met stiff opposition and are rarely enacted. Even in progressive states like here in Washington, legislative proposals and ballot initiatives proposing carbon taxes have failed. Why? What explains the political resistance to these promising ways to address the climate change crisis? And what, if anything, can be done to change the public's perception of carbon pricing policies? So fortunately, we have with us tonight a person, no better person, I think, than our speaker, who can address these issues. Aseem Prakash is the Walker Family Professor for the College of Arts and Sciences and the founding director of the Center for Environmental Politics at the University of Washington. Dr. Prakash is the author or editor of many books, including Greening the Firm, The Politics of Corporate Environmentalism, published by Cambridge University Press, The Voluntary Environmentalists, also published by Cambridge University Press, Advocacy Organizations and Collective Action, published by Cambridge, and Voluntary Programs, A Club Theory Perspective, published by MIT Press. In addition to numerous articles published in the leading journals of political science, international relations, legal studies, and business, he regularly contributes to more popular outlets such as Slate magazine, the Washington Post, HuffPost, Regulatory Review, and The Hill. Professor Prakash is a member of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine Board on Environmental Change in Society, and he is also an International Research Fellow at the Center for Corporate Reputation at Oxford University. Please join me now in welcoming my friend Aseem Prakash.
Thank you, and thanks for braving the snow. In Seattle, we would have closed the university. And of course, the city for the next 1 week. So it's nice that at least somebody functions in the state of Washington. So I'm going to talk about from Eiffel Tower to the Space Needle. Eiffel Tower is the icon of France, where a lot of protests against the carbon tax have taken place. And Space Needle, of course, Seattle. And as Cornell said, the state of Washington voted down carbon tax twice. So we want to understand why it is happening that in a fairly liberal state, there is lack of support for the carbon tax. And my explanation points to the political factors, and what I would try to do is to not only point out the problem, but also suggest some solutions that how we can move forward on unquestionably one of the most important issues of our times. So if we step back and say, okay, what exactly are the major challenges for climate action? And by climate action, I mean reduction of the emissions of greenhouse gases. So the first challenge is what we call the global commons problem. That reduction in carbon dioxide emissions creates a global benefit that everybody can enjoy, what you call a global public good. But the cost of reducing it is more often than not concentrated on particular individuals or sectors. So we have global benefits but private costs. And obviously people when they're faced with the situation, want to either free ride or in an election situation want to oppose this imposition of costs. And this is an issue across political spectrum. So it's not that it's a liberal problem or a conservative problem. A lot of people respond the same way when posed with this kind of a choice. The second is what we call the cost-benefit asymmetries. That the costs and benefits of mitigating climate change are borne by different actors. So for example, if we impose a very steep tax or new regulations on coal, then it's the coal miners and the coal industry and the downstream industries that are going to be bearing much of the cost. Whereas the benefits of reduced carbon emissions, again, are global. Or if we support renewable energy, then it's really the states where the renewable energy is well established are going to reap the benefits at the cost of the coal miners. So as long as there is an asymmetry between who bears the cost and who reaps the benefits, people who lose out, people who bear the cost, have an incentive to organize and oppose that policy. And their ability and effectiveness to organize increases if they already have some kind of a collective action forum like a union. So that's why labor unions, although the level of unionization is diminishing in the US, still exercise a sizable power, because the blue-collar unions, the AFL-CIO, the Teamsters, are by and large against climate action, because they think it will cost or it will impose cost on their members, which are predominantly blue-collar workers. And at the peril of simplifying it, this in a sense is Mr. Trump's appeal, because he's appealing to a section of population, right or wrong, believes that they are bearing the costs for whatever policies we talk about. Third is what we call the China excuse. Because it is a global public good, and the major emitters are China and India, an argument that's often made is that even if we were to reduce our carbon emissions, China will not. So our efforts are in vain. So because China will not reduce its emissions to the same extent, it may decelerate the increase in emissions, but it's not reducing emissions. It's still building coal plants left, right, and center. And so is India. And you can't blame them, because that's the resource they have. But from the perspective of people in the United States and developed world who are told that you have to do something to reduce climate change and this would cost you jobs, their response is, well, even if we close our coal plants, China will not. So why should we? Because eventually it's a global public goods problem. Everybody has to do it. The fourth is what I call the SUV hypocrisy. I have so many friends who are ardent environmentalists and drive SUVs. And when I confront them, because I'm an unpleasant person, they say, well, you do what you got to do. Fair enough. All of us have been in this situation. But the problem is we are not willing to undertake behavioral changes. We are not willing to incur costs ourselves in terms of lifestyle changes, but we want others to do so. So it's an inherently political question. One of the important sources of carbon dioxide, of greenhouse gas emissions is meat. The meat industry is contributing about 14 to 50% of methane, and methane is horrible. So if you think of a policy proposal where we say, you know what, let's ration meat. If you're eating it 4 times a week, start eating twice a week. Imagine the backlash. Because you are going to impose lifestyle changes. You're going to become a nanny girl. But in reality, beef industry in particular, but meat industry in general, is a horrible, horrible source of greenhouse gas emissions. So in a sense, our behavioral choices, our lifestyles is leading to climate change. It's not the big oil. It's not the big, McDonald's or whatever. Because we are trapped or we seek certain lifestyles, it's creating incentives for the firms to produce those products which lead to the carbon emission problem or the methane emission problem that we're talking about. And finally, it's what we call the agency perception, which is kind of a China problem, but in a slightly different way. People feel a sense of helplessness. And there's a lot of research in psychology that suggests that if people feel their actions are not going to have a tangible impact, they'd rather not undertake that action. And especially if that action is costly. So there are several different factors which are structural and behavioral, and which are inherently political, which is posing a very important challenge for climate action, whether at the level of the government, at the level of the firm, or at the level of the individual. So the question then is, okay, how do we actually undertake climate action? What are the mechanisms, who are the actors who can allow us, help us, enable us to reduce these emissions? So one is obviously the government. That's what we turn to, that's what we've historically turned to. We can regulate like the Clean Power Plan. We can have market-based incentives like carbon tax, something I'll talk about more. Then we can have things like cap and trade, which is very popular in Europe. It's called EU ETS, Emission Trading Scheme, and now in California. And we can have renewable portfolio standard mandates for public utilities. So a lot of states compel their utilities to have certain proportion of electricity generated from renewables. Washington State is different because we are very rich in hydro. It's not a big problem for us. But in states that were highly dependent on coal, this is a very important issue, the RPG standards. Or the government can go at the problem from the other side, what we call the supply side, the spending. The government can offer tax breaks. That's how many industries actually have gotten started all over the world, government subsidies. The government can invest in mass transit, take people off roads, and the government can invest in research and development. Old style and the new style like geoengineering, carbon capture technologies, and so on and so forth. So the government is probably the most important actor that can impact emissions both from the demand side and from the supply side. Second is NGOs. So apart from political mobilization, what NGOs can do is to directly name and shame firms. They're already doing that for governments, and they can highlight which firms are doing well on the carbon parameters and which are not. And there are lots of what we call carbon registers, which firms are included if they are doing well or not doing so well. NGOs can also litigate. Litigation is a very important strategy for the environmental movement. And that is because historically, the way laws were written, there are opportunities and incentives for NGOs to litigate. Opportunities in the sense, the issue of standing, that you don't have to demonstrate an injury to litigate. And second, in some statutes, you can actually claim to be what we call a private attorney general. So you can not only litigate, you can also recoup the cost of litigation by undertaking that litigating process because you're serving a public purpose. That's what the argument is. Firms are a very important actors in climate action, something we don't quite appreciate. They're not only a source of problem, they're also important sources of solutions. And that's why this anti-capitalist rhetoric slightly scares me, because it is turning firms into antagonists. And it doesn't have to be that way. One can have a collaborative relationship with a very large number of firms. Firms have actually started taking carbon action very seriously. Not all, but quite a few have. And a couple of ways they're doing it is they are greening their supply chain. That means they have certain standards about emissions, and they want all their suppliers spread all over the world to follow those standards. And there are specific voluntary programs, voluntary regulatory programs that allow firms to diffuse their environmental norms, their environmental practices all over the world. The firms are also undertaking what's called carbon accounting. So along with the regular fiscal accounting, some firms have started maintaining carbon accounting. What's the carbon footprint? So there are several ways that the firms can first document their carbon footprint and then take appropriate actions to reduce it. And finally, it's all of us, individuals. We can ditch our SUVs. We don't have to drive trucks. I know it's not going to happen immediately, but eventually we will have to make these choices. We can go electric, hybrid, we can carpool, and I'm not talking about binary choice that either you carpool or you don't. But instead of driving solo 5 times a week, drive 3 times a week. 2 days a week, have a small behavioral change, see how it works, and then build on that. And not everybody will be able to do it, that's fine. But as long as we start thinking critically about our own behavior and how we ought to change our own behavior, I think we start moving the needle. Because we become not only victims, we become agents of change. And that's important. We have to get back agency and feel that we can actually make a difference. Not depend on the government, not depend on the firms, but we can do it ourselves. We can fly less. So I'm part of an initiative where we are naming and shaming universities about flying issues. And I wrote an op-ed in Huffington Post, which we call the climate change hypocrisy of jet-setting academics. And a lot of my friends who serve on IPCC were absolutely furious, and remain furious even today. But I think we are hypocrites as academics. We know this problem, we know the solutions, but we are not willing to change our lifestyles. So we are suggesting several small initiatives, starting with carbon accounting. Maybe don't have annual conferences, have conferences every other year of major professional associations. AGU, American Geophysical Union, their annual meeting attracts 60,000 people. Imagine the carbon footprint. American Political Science Association, a lot of us were members of that, attracts 7,000 to 8,000 people. International Studies Association attracts 6,000 to 7,000 people. People coming from all over the world. All these IPCC meetings are held in fancy places. And I have a lot of these friends who are showing off, oh, I'm in Haiti, I'm here. Oh, I'm so busy. But this is our hypocrisy. So we all have to be self-critical and say, am I the source of problem? And can academia lead by example? And again, I'm not talking about drastic no flying. What we're saying is start reducing it. First, start counting it. In annual reports, why can't we have a carbon section? What was your carbon footprint? And let people calculate how much they've traveled and report on that. So there are ways where we can, as community of scholars, become a bit more self-critical and start becoming a part of solution. And of course, individuals can also sue. So Juliana versus United States, that individuals in your age group have sued the federal government for climate inaction. And it has withstood several challenges even in the Supreme Court. So it's very interesting how the case will proceed, because they are using a very novel doctrine, the public trust doctrine, which has not been tested on this scale. But the fact of the matter is that we are not victims. We are agents of change. And we are agents of morality. And unless until we recognize that, the problem will not be solved. So as Cornell said, that carbon tax is supposed to be one of the most desirable, from an economic theory perspective, instrument for mitigating climate change. And the argument is pretty simple, that firms, individuals are able to emit carbon dioxide because they don't pay for it. The costs are externalized. These are called market failures. And the best way to correct market failures is to force the polluters to bear those costs, what we call internalizing externalities. So if we impose a tax that is equal to what is called the social cost of carbon, something, we have very good estimates, then we can force people to bear the full costs of their carbon emissions. So in theory, it is beautiful. Because people who are actually causing the pollution are bearing the cost, and that's the way it should be. There's no cross-subsidization. And it's a clear price signal. We work through the market, we avoid the government, except when it comes to imposing the tax and collecting the tax. So in theory, it makes a lot of sense. But like many good things in life, in theory they are very good, but in practice they fail. So why are we seeing this kind of a backlash against a carbon tax? So one is, there are obviously design issues. How high should the tax be so that people actually start noticing that there's a carbon tax? So think of this way. The gasoline price in the United States of America during a 12-month period typically varies between 80 cents to $1. So if you impose a tax that raises the price by 14 cents, would anybody even notice it? No. And that was the proposal of the carbon tax suggested in the state of Washington in 2018. 14 cents a gallon, that's it. So a lot of people say, well, you'll have to have a carbon tax of at least $120, $130. And you'll have to raise the price of gasoline by a very substantial amount so that people actually start noticing the price signal. By 2005, the share of SUVs in the total sale of new vehicles had fallen below 50%. In fact, it had fallen almost to 43, 44%. Now it has again shot back above 50%. Although, in real terms, the price of oil has not come down that much. And the reason is, oil is cheap. And people are used to cheap oil. And if you really want to make oil expensive through a price signal, so that people don't buy SUVs and go electric or buy, fuel efficient gasoline car, you'll have to have a very high level of carbon tax. That is issue one. How high should the tax be? Second, who should bear the costs? So there is an assumption which I find so interesting. People think firms should pick up the cost of tax, not consumers. In fact, during 2018 carbon tax campaign, as you were going door to door, people said, well, I'm so angry because I have to pay the carbon tax, not the firms. I said, but aren't you the one who's pumping gasoline? So why should the firms pay? It's them. I said, no, it's you. So there's this disconnect that we are the virtuous people. It's these bad oil firms that should bear the cost of tax. They should not pass it on to us. Of course, the level to which firms can pass on the cost depends on market conditions, price elasticity of demand, and so on and so forth. But this is a very important issue. Who is going to pick up the cost? Third is, this is where the bloodbath begins. How would tax money be used? Most of the fights are not about how much to tax, but how the money will be spent. Distributional politics, in the worst sense. So in 2016, the state of Washington was given a choice to enact what we call a revenue neutral carbon tax. That we'll impose a carbon tax, but we'll give money back to people in terms of tax rebates. And a lot of the moderate Republicans are championing the same kind of revenue neutral carbon tax. That you tax carbon, but you give the money back either as carbon dividends, as tax cuts, or something like that. So that we don't have any fights over how the money would be used. Should it be wind bill? Should it be solar panel? Should it be mass transit? Or X, Y, or Z? But there's another school of thought that says no. We need carbon tax to be revenue positive, so that we get money to spend on stuff. We need electric charging stations, we need mass transit, we need subsidies for wind and solar. This is a good argument. I'm not saying it's a bad argument. But this is the source of distributional conflicts. How should the money be spent? And of course, the issue of equity. Because the proportion of family income spent on energy is much higher for poor sections of society. So carbon tax imposes a disproportionate burden on poor people. So do we have some ways to offset that burden? Because already the poor people are facing severe economic hardships, even at the time of a full employment economy. Last but not the least is what we call carbon leakages. So suppose we manage to enact a very stringent carbon tax in the United States of America, but some other country, say China or India, doesn't have that tax. The firms may simply relocate to these countries and export back their products. Some people say this is what has happened because of NAFTA, which is actually not true. But this is what the popular perception is. So carbon leakages through trade are a very important concern if carbon tax is only in one jurisdiction, but it's not worldwide. So these are some very important design issues with inherent political implications in the whole discourse on carbon tax. Of course, one often sees these surveys that global warming concerns steady despite blah blah blah, or more and more Americans believe that climate change is happening. Widespread support for climate change policies. You get bombarded with these surveys all the time, and we've written separately that these surveys are quite misleading. I'll not go through the list of issues, but the fact is, if there is so much of popular support for carbon tax, why are we not observing that in the ballot box? And politicians are very smart people. If they actually see a major shift in public attitudes towards carbon tax, why are they still opposing any kind of climate action? So obviously the surveys are not correctly describing the public mood, the public attitudes. And that's why the policy needle has remained static. Some would say it's even gone back. So let's start with France. The Paris Summit, the Paris Agreement of 2015 was really a big moment in France's glorious history. They were anointed as a climate leader, they led the charge on climate change, and it was a voluntary agreement that countries voluntarily pledged, China for the first time, but also India, to reduce their carbon emissions. It was a voluntary pledge, but it's the first time China and India were willing to even offer those pledges. And France played a very important role. President Hollande got a lot of glory. And in 2016, when it was formally ratified in New York, in the United Nations, you had the glitterati, you had DiCaprio and other kinds of very famous people, celebrities, gracing that occasion. So it was a big deal. France was the climate leader. France was the response to retrograde climate policies that we allegedly see in the United States. And then of course in 2017, when President Trump announced that the United States would withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord, President Macron was very vocal in opposing it.
Today, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, announced his decision to withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement. I do respect this decision, but I do think it is an actual mistake, both for the US and for our planet. To all scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs, responsible citizens who were disappointed by the decision of the President of the United States, I want to say that they will find in France a second homeland. I call on them, come and work here with us. I reaffirm clearly that the Paris Agreement remains irreversible and will be implemented, not just by France, but by all the other nations. We will succeed because we are fully committed.
So this is President Macron in 2017 making this very interesting and persuasive argument about France's continued leadership and inviting technologists, scientists from the United States to relocate to France to pursue climate change issues. But in 2019, it was a very, very different France. President Macron announced a new green levy on transportation fuel. And it generated a very widespread protest called the Yellow Vests. Let's see if we can see, just give me a second. You'll be able to.
Let's hope.
The government says these were the most violent protests in Paris in over 50 years. On Saturday, 133 people were injured and more than 400 were arrested. The movement began 3 weeks ago on social media, with calls to protest a tax on fuel. But it's grown into a working-class revolt against the economic policies of President Emmanuel Macron. 27-year-old Jimmy Moreno came in from a nearby suburb. He works for the railways and voted for Macron.
So it's a longer video, and I'll encourage you to watch it online. But the issue is, in 2019, France has turned against climate leadership. That even against imposition of green taxes, green levies on fuels. So in 2 years, from a climate leader, France is on the defensive, and of course, in the wake of these protests, the green levies were withdrawn, and Mr. President Macron went in a very defensive mode. So what happened? If you try to figure out France, so the protest is not really against climate policy. The protest is against elitism. Because President Macron earlier has given tax concessions to the rich, to the wealthy, because he thinks France is an overtaxed economy. So if one follows the script and one sees the account, people are angry that they are being asked to bear the costs of climate change when the rich are getting tax breaks. So this is some kind of a carbon elitism. That there is a perception that the climate costs are being borne by ordinary people to serve elite preferences. The elite are not willing to sacrifice. There is no sense of a shared sacrifice. So climate change becomes an elite issue. And in the United States, you see the same rhetoric in several places. The climate and environmental issues is really pitting the coastal metropolitan elites versus the American heartland. That's where the Rust Belt, the Midwest, votes in a particular way on environmental issues, and it's really the coastal elites that are pushing for it. So this is a very serious issue of climate policy equals elitism. So now let's move to our own state, the state of Washington. The most beautiful campus town in the country and the most beautiful city in the country, right? Pullman and Seattle, both two very beautiful places. And it's a blue state. And in 2018, there was actually a blue wave. The 8th district was flipped. So what happened? So first is, let's see what happened in 2016. As I said, we had a revenue neutral version of carbon tax proposed in 2016. And the idea was that much of the tax money will be given back in terms of sales tax. State of Washington is, as you know, we don't have income tax, but we have a very high sales tax, which is very regressive. So this was a very progressive policy, reducing sales tax. But even beyond that, they had apportioned money to help people who would be disproportionately hurt, especially the poorer people. So they were very cognizant of social justice issues. But for some very interesting reasons, and I can talk about that more in the Q&As, most environmental groups except for Sierra Club opposed 732. And it was a bitter opposition. There was some modest TV spending. The Yes for Climate, Yes 732 spent about $3 million, No spent about $1.5 million. In reality, what happened is, it lost. In 2016, it lost. It got barely 41% vote. It's a huge loss. So one would say, well, maybe all liberals lost. Actually, that's not true. Hillary Clinton, who actually lost the primaries in the state of Washington to Bernie, 2:1 ratio, even Hillary got 52.5% vote. And it's not that people voted for Trump. Trump only got 37%, but there was a lot of protest vote to Gary Johnson, the Green Party, and so on and so forth. Just that. If you look at US Senate, Pat Berry got 59% vote in the same election cycle. And Governor Jay Inslee got 54% plus. So the liberal ticket did quite well in the state of Washington in 2016. Moreover, some very liberal ballot measures like a minimum wage, funding for sound transit, passed. So it's not that there was a backlash against liberal measures. There was no backlash against liberal politicians. There was no backlash against liberal measures. And even liberal measures that impose some kind of a levy or a tax, like sound transit. But carbon tax lost. And one of the important reasons it was supposed, speculated, is because the environmental groups and the left liberal coalition did not support it. Okay, fast forward. Act 2. In 2018, there's a second version of carbon tax, but it's a slightly different carbon tax. It's a revenue positive. Roughly speaking, it would generate $1 billion of revenue. Roughly speaking, because it changes. It starts with about 600 million, and then keeps on rising. And how this money would be spent would be decided by a 15-member board appointed by the governor. And all environmental groups supported. So the liberal coalition thought they were going to win. All the liberals are united. It's a liberal state. There is a high distrust for President Trump, and we are going to ride the liberal wave. So what happened? So there was a very, very aggressive media campaign on both sides, and a couple of us, including Professor Travis Vidal. So all of us are involved in this project to understand whether advertising made a difference. Because the claim is that liberals lost, or I-1631 lost because of the spending mismatch, 2:1 ratio. And we want to establish that empirically. Is it really true? So just to give you a sense of the ad campaigns, let's see. So I think we'll have to do that trick again.
Let's do that trick again. Are we doing yes first?
Yes, please.
What they burn, we breathe. Polluters have poisoned our air and water, creating a mess and harming our health. Initiative 1631 holds them accountable, charging a fee for this and reinvesting it in this. The big oil companies don't support it, but doctors and the American Lung Association do. Because 1631 means cleaner air and water, thousands of clean energy jobs, and a better future for them. Vote yes on 1631, paid for by Clean Air, Clean Energy Washington.
Now let's see an ad from the No Coalition.
I-1631's energy tax would increase consumer prices for gasoline, electricity, natural gas, and heating fuel, costing families more than $400 in the first year, increasing automatically every year with no cap. But 1631 exempts many of Washington's largest polluters. Consumers would pay billions for no significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. It's costly, unfair, and ineffective. Vote no on 1631.
So Travis and our group is also coding all the ads in terms of what frames were used. Was the message cluttered? Was the message focused? Etc. etc. And our very preliminary analysis suggests, it's very preliminary, that the no side was much more focused on costs. and yes side, or yes on 1631, the message was much more diffused. So of course, we'll see how it works out. But one intuition is that the no side understood that people are very worried about costs. Private costs, public benefits. And they harped on that. And for good or for bad, that seems to have stuck with people. Okay. So 1631 receives only 43% vote. It's quite sad if you compare it with 732. There's only a 3 percentage point increase when liberals come together in a liberal state. And this is when Maria Cantwell gets re-elected by 58% vote. 58% vote. So every fourth Cantwell voter did not vote for the carbon tax. And what we've done is we plotted county-wise voting percentage. And essentially it's only in 3 counties where the vote share of 1631 exceeds 50%. And you see the gap between Cantwell and 1631, it is almost parallel to the 50% line. So this erosion of support, it's not a liberal, it's not a Eastern Washington, Western Washington story. It is a Washington story. There's an erosion of support all across counties. So why is the carbon tax so unpopular? It seems to make economic sense, but still people are not happy. So one is the elitism hypothesis we talked about. Second issue, if one digs into this, so maybe climate change is not the most pressing problem. And let's see if you have any evidence of that. So when people are asked, what do you think is the most pressing problem? They don't say climate change, and they don't vote that way. So the first, the sniff test is, okay, let's see Florida. Florida has been probably at the forefront of climate devastation. It's almost an annual ritual. They'll get hurricanes and people have to run for their lives and property damage. So Florida must be very sensitive to climate issues, right? It must be in vanguard of climate change, but no. Florida elects a climate denier as its governor and unseats a liberal senator and elects a climate denier to the Senate. This is Florida. So obviously personal experience with climate extreme weather events is not changing perceptions. There is a deeper problem here that all of us need to think about. Let's go back to 2014. When people were asked your level of worry about national problems, climate change in 2014 was almost at the bottom. Only 24% people said that they worry a great deal about climate problems versus 59% for the economy. So about 2.5 times more. Fast forward to 2016. Look at exit poll data. When people are asked, okay, what issues motivated your vote? Economy. The most important issue was the economy. Then came immigration, terrorism, and foreign policy. Climate change, environmental issues did not figure in the top 4 issues that motivated voting in 2016 exit polls. Fast forward 2018 exit polls. What's the most important issue facing the economy when people are asked after they have cast their vote? Healthcare is most important, followed by immigration, economy, and gun policy. And of course, there is some partisan division, but the bottom line is climate change is not figuring in the top 4-5 issues that is motivating voting. And this was supposed to be a climate change referendum. We've had, UNFCCC reports, we have this report and that report, but somehow people are not getting convinced that climate change is an important enough problem to motivate their vote. So what's the way forward? I'm just telling you bad stories. So there are a few suggestions I'd like to make based on our writing, our scholarship. So one is just transition, building bipartisanship, ethic of individual responsibility, and talking about political actions or technical reports. So let me talk about these issues in order. I talked about how blue-collar unions are quite opposed to the climate action in the current format. Though there are some changes, there's something called the Blue-Green Alliance that is trying to marry the labor issues with environmental issues. But Richard Trumka, who's the president of AFL-CIO, you read his statement. That's the statement he gave in San Francisco at the climate summit last year. And then read the statement of the president of the United Mine Workers. So the takeaway is what I initially suggested. Climate policy imposes local costs that are concentrated on a few sectors. And these costs could be coming now, or people anticipate these costs in the future. So these sectors, these actors have an incentive to mobilize opposed climate change. And unless until environmental groups, climate movement outlines a path for a just transition, what we call embedded environmentalism, embed environmentalism in a new social compact that tells people, you know what, we realize the costs are imposed on you, but this is how we are going to help you. So I tell my environmental friends all the time, I would really want all of you to stop coming to Seattle, San Francisco, LA, and New York, and go to Appalachia, go to West Virginia, and go to all those places where you find the most intense opposition. This is exactly what Gandhi did. Go to the heartland and ask people why they're opposing it. And more importantly, work with them to find a solution so that if climate policies are enacted, they are not thrown to the wolves. Instead of castigating them, telling them they're this and that, and hurling invective of the day, empathize them. You know, they're people like you. And they're becoming strangers in their own land. So it is important that we embrace a mindset of inclusion and try to understand the concerns of the people we disagree with. And I don't think environmental movement has quite done that. You see, either you're with us, if you're not with us, then you're a climate skeptic, you're a climate denier, you're a reactionary, X, Y, or Z, and many other things thrown in. So obviously it creates reaction, it creates opposition. So first thing to move forward is we have to change our mindset, people first. And people first, including people who are going to suffer because of climate action. Because if we can win them over, climate action will happen. Second is, let's start with the areas where we can agree with. Climate change doesn't have to be a partisan issue. Everybody wants to live, right? Many people have kids and grandkids. People have properties. 60 to 70% of America lives within 100 miles of the coast. And one area where, for example, where I think bipartisanship can be encouraged is wind energy. Most Republican governors in the Midwest are strong supporters of wind energy because farmers love wind energy. It's a steady source of revenue. It's not susceptible to business cycles. And it is really not disrupting the farming operations. So the Wind Energy Coalition is a bipartisan coalition. And some of the most important states in our country where wind energy has high salience are the red states. Amongst the top 5, 4 are red states or purple states. So if we start talking about wind energy instead of climate change, instead of Green New Deal, etc., we do it with labels and we say, can we promote wind energy? Can we have a bipartisan push to promote wind energy and maybe triple the installed capacity? Or whatever we want to do, based on a bipartisan coalition. Because once we start building trust that we don't have an ideological agenda, we want America to do better and we want the planet to be saved, I think we get more traction. The same thing happens with solar energy, though to a lesser extent. The third point is individual responsibility. Consumption is politics. When you buy any good or service, you're actually signaling your political preferences. You're voting with your dollars. Because you're supporting a particular lifestyle and you're supporting a particular company. So all of us have to become more cognizant that our dollars are making political statements. we should very carefully look at labels. Every time you go to a grocery store or you go and buy, ask them, are they carrying a particular product with a particular label? Stores have to understand, firms have to understand that there's a consumer demand, because they are responding to what we want. So I worked at Procter & Gamble in marketing, and I know Procter & Gamble is so invested in understanding. That's how Google and others are making money. They're trying to understand our preferences. What do we want? Where do we shop? So if we start voicing our concerns with the climate as consumers, it will make a huge difference. Write letters, comment on Facebook, whatever is your means of communication, tell firms that climate change is important to you. And you're going to reward or punish based on their climate track record. And of course, buying electric, reducing meat consumption, all those things that we've already talked about. And this is what I like to needle my Seattle friends. Subaru is actually technically a truck. They did this ruse of reclassifying Subaru as a truck to get it out of the CAFE standards. So a lot of my environmental friends drive Subarus. So in Seattle I call it the Subaru hypocrisy. That you can't be a liberal environmentalist and drive a Subaru. And you can't plead ignorance, because I've just told you. So I think the bottom line is we have to become self-critical instead of pointing fingers at others, especially people who profess so much of concern about the climate. I've talked about elites leading by examples. And finally, I think, so we have a short piece we are doing on this, that the environmental movement is working with the wrong theory of change. So the basic model that seems to be in operation is that there is lack of knowledge, and lack of knowledge is due to policy inaction. If we provide this knowledge, we bridge the knowledge deficit, policy action will happen. And if the knowledge we provide through our climate reports scares people, then people will be scared into acting and enacting climate laws. So we have this huge industry of IPCC and climate experts that are writing very good reports. They're excellent scientific reports. But climate change is not a scientific and technical issue. It's a political issue. That's why we need politics. We've done very well on science, and thanks for the scientists. But now I think politics needs to come at the center stage. We have to understand who wins, who loses. Why are people behaving in a particular way? Why are they disregarding scientific information? And why is more scientific information freezing preferences, not diluting them? And on that count, I think AOC, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, with all the flaws in her plan, I think she has to be given the credit because she's brought climate action to the center stage. She's outlined ideas. I don't think she's outlined a plan. She's outlined ideas. Some of them are quite wacky. But at least she has started a political conversation about policies. She's forcing everybody to take a stand. Either you agree or disagree. If you disagree, tell me what the alternative is. And how should we prioritize these 2 million objectives she has? So this is generating excitement. And to some extent it is positive because there's a hunger amongst all of us that we need climate action. We don't need you're a climate denier, you're a climate skeptic, I am this, you're that. That's old news. Or a new IPCC report. That's old news. That doesn't help. We need now get climate change in the streets, in the boardrooms, and have active debates and have active activism and force our policymakers, force firms to take a position and not obfuscation. And I think this is why I think there is a positive development on this count. So to conclude, the reason carbon tax fails is that citizens don't view climate change as a pressing issue, especially placed in the context of other problems. So whenever there is a climate survey thrown at you, that 80% support climate change, say really, how was the question framed? Were people asked? So one of the most ridiculous surveys published by Yale in recent days, they say 85% of Americans support New Green Deal. And then the next is 80% don't know what New Green Deal is. You go and check it for yourself. And people have picked up the first line and advertised everywhere. Mass support, widespread support for the Green New Deal. Nonsense. I hope there was. But people don't understand what it is. Second, tax is a taboo word in politics, especially American politics. So 1631, they didn't call it a tax, they called it a carbon fee. But the opponents framed it as a tax, and people viewed it as a tax. So we may have to think about non-tax ways like cap and trade to approach climate problems because of the particular politics surrounding the vocabulary. And tax becomes particularly taboo if there's a perception that tax is, the burden is being borne disproportionately by poor people, which is the climate ad you saw, which is the message from Eiffel Tower. And at the end of the day, if we want climate action, we should be willing to pay for it through our dollars and through our votes. Because eventually the buck stops here. It's we the people and we the consumers. And for far too long, we want others to do the dirty job for us. And I think this is the democracy disconnect. So unless until we take agency back and say, we are going to vote with our dollars and we are going to signal our preferences through our votes, not much climate action will happen.
So we have about 20 minutes or so for Q&A. Maybe I'll start us off. See, one of the things you didn't talk about is partisan polarization and how that plays into the debate over climate change and action on climate change. And we know that that is one of the major indicators of people's attitudes about climate change and whether they're reacting on it. What would you suggest in terms of removing this issue from partisan polarization? In particular, how can we get Republican leaders, elites, to adopt a more aggressive stance on climate change?
Excellent. So Cornell is absolutely right. So we do a lot of survey work, and the variable partisanship dominates all the other variables. The single most important variable predicting attitudes towards climate change is partisan affiliation or partisanship. So how do we actually build bipartisanship? So we have written a bit about that, and there are a couple of new ideas, but let me start with an anecdote. I was in Grand Rapids last year, and I'd organized a panel. It was part of a non-profit conference, and I'd organized a panel on climate change, and I invited local environmental groups to participate. And we were sitting in the DeVos Plaza. Betsy DeVos is from Grand Rapids. They are the big players there. Amway's headquarters in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And everywhere I saw statements about climate change in DeVos Plaza. LEED certification, that kind of stuff. So this is so odd. I thought, there'd be a different kind of ambience to this, not proclaiming their climate credentials. So after the workshop, I went to these sales. I said, what am I missing here? So they started laughing. They said, actually, the DeVos people are some of the most aggressive in climate adaptation. They had a few facilities along the Grand Rapids River which got flooded, and after that they said, you know what, this is not going to happen again. So they have invested a lot on climate adaptation. It's that they don't call it climate adaptation. They call it resilience. So one is a vocabulary problem. A lot of people are doing climate stuff but don't want to call it because climate stuff has become toxic. That's why I think it's important, if you do green energy, let's not call it climate, let's call it green energy. Let's say, I do wind, I do solar, instead of giving it a climate label. That's one. It's a labeling issue. Second is, there is much more political support even amongst Republicans for adaptation versus mitigation. And that is because adaptation benefits are local. If I am strengthening my seawall or my riverbank to make sure the next flood is not destroying property, the benefits are local. That's why people are not against taxes per se. People support, taxes for schools, taxes for this, taxes for that, because the benefits are local. So one important way, look, climate change is happening. And all of us are going to be hit by it, and we'll have to adapt. So we have two challenges. One, how to mitigate so that it doesn't get worse. And second, how do we start adapting? Adaptation has been a taboo word in climate movement because they felt if we talk about adaptation, we will have a fewer incentives to mitigate, which some of our work shows is not true. But this is what the belief is. So my suggestions are twofold. First is let's not talk climate, let's not give the climate label. And second, let's talk about adaptation. And instead of saying climate adaptation, let's say preventing next floods, drought proofing, creating new reservoirs in eastern Washington so that we can capture water for agricultural purposes. And I think with these policies, we are creating local benefits and we are making local governments, local officials, local people more used to the idea of investing in local infrastructure. So my sense is that would have a much greater buy-in. But this goes against the political instincts of environmental groups. Because if climate change becomes a non-issue and gets rebranded and broken up, then they have a political problem. So climate groups, environmental groups don't like what we suggest and we get a lot of pushback from them. Like, why don't we call the problem the way it is? So we have a choice. Either we call the problem the way it is or we actually try to solve the problem by calling it something else. So this is what I think is the way forward, at least in the short run.
Can I ask two quick questions real quick? So my first question is, will we be able to keep the level of production of goods and services while like making it all green friendly? And my second question is, like, seeing as a lot of people don't want to change, like people are immune to change, it seems like, how could we or like big firms innovate so people don't have to change yet we become more green as a whole?
You'll have to change. All of us will have to change. The issue is who changes and to what extent. So I think it will be, but you know, you have changed. You didn't have a cell phone 10 years ago. Maybe you don't recall that. When I arrived in the US in 1993, I didn't know what email was. And cell phone is a phenomenon only of last 10 years. The smartphone. All of us have changed. Change is part of our DNA. So I don't think we are against change. The idea is how do we make a change that's just, and that is something people agree with. I'm not saying everybody will agree with it, but we create what we call a winning coalition. That says, you know, this change is positive and it's worth our while doing it.
I mean, like, one can argue that the invent of the cell phone made people's lives easier, and a lot of innovations and inventions make people's lives more convenient, and that's why they buy into it, and they buy into the cheaper product. Whereas changing for climate change would necessarily make it inconvenient or inconvenient. I mean,
excellent. So you're raising a good point. That some changes improve our quality of life, they create benefits, and some changes impose costs. And in your perception, the changes required for climate change are going to impose costs. And that's why they're being opposed. And I think that's a very fair argument. That the way climate change has been portrayed is a cost, not as an opportunity. So that connects to Conran's point. We have to start thinking climate change as an opportunity. And for example, the number of green jobs actually far exceed by a factor of 4 to 5. By green jobs mean jobs involved in solar and wind, than the number of people involved in coal industry. But we never think it that way. And that is because much of the climate rhetoric is what is wrong. So if we change the rhetoric and start talking what is right, what are the opportunities, and how it will actually improve our quality of life. So for example, we have now switched to Prius plug-in. And it is beautiful. We get 30 miles and it is a very smooth drive. I feel very nice driving a Prius plug-in. So for me, it's a benefit. It's lower cost because electricity is so cheap in the state of Washington, and it's a smoother ride. Not every change will have this win-win situation, but the idea is that people should see the value in it. What we have failed is to communicate the value of adapting to climate change in new and innovative ways. Yeah?
I haven't come up with a way to not frame this negatively, but to what extent do you think it's going to be a fear tactic that really gets people to change their behavior? Coming from a health background, looking at the public health sides of things, if you're trying to get somebody to change their behavior, it takes them understanding that what they're doing right now is going to have negative long-term consequences. So how do you localize climate change to people individually in each state and make it a problem the household level as opposed to national or global level.
So you're right, this is called the tipping point problem. So when will the tipping point come? How many more hurricanes, how much more devastation will the country have to tolerate before it says climate change is real? So let me give you an example from a different context. So in 1930s, America was very isolationist. And Americans didn't want to get into these wars with Europeans. So what happened was that America was heavily underinvesting in the army. It still had a decent navy. And there were laws that prohibited America from getting entangled in international wars. So when Hitler invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, Senator Bora from Idaho went to the floor of the Senate and said, if I had just gotten an opportunity to talk with Adolf Hitler, I could have prevented the invasion. And America should not intervene. So even after the attack on Poland, America did not intervene. And America did not change its laws so that America could actively, of course there was a lend and lease program, but that was kind of skirting the conventional regulations. America got into World War II after Pearl Harbor. It was a complete exogenous shock. Some people said, well, we should have seen it coming because the indication was there, but that completely flipped the political sentiment. Some people have said, when will our Pearl Harbor moment come? It's like the 3 Mile Island that kills the nuclear industry in the United States. So that is one school of thought. I would suggest that instead of waiting for the Pearl Harbor to happen, we should probably become a bit more proactive, because the costs of this kind of a devastation would be quite huge and maybe irreversible in many ways. So I think we have an opportunity to be proactive, and it's not that people are always resistant to change, and I think that conversation was very useful. We have to provide a new narrative that if we take climate action, our lives will actually be better. And I think this is the new narrative that the Green New Deal has the potential, it is not yet providing, to provide. Because if it can mobilize people for a better future through a particular path, then I think we will see some improvements. It will not be dramatic, it will be gradual, it will be incremental, but I think that's the way forward, instead of waiting for the Pearl Harbor to happen.
Do you think you can make it into a more localized discussion? Like it will be, on average, 5 degrees hotter at its peak in the summer. That heat will differentially affect people of different classes in different places, Florida versus New England.
You know, I wish it was true. We had this nasty smoke problem in August that shut down Western and Eastern Washington. Still people didn't support the carbon tax. And it was a problem, it was a public health problem. I know families with kids with asthma, they had a horrible time. There was a huge problem for Walla Walla tourism industry, as I understand. And a lot of the industry was shut down because people would not travel in this kind of a nasty smoke. But still, people voted against the carbon tax. So clearly it wasn't of the sufficient scale. It was not the climate Pearl Harbor that would flip preferences. Ma'am. Yeah, you.
Me?
Oh, you had a hand up? No.
Oh, no.
No, okay.
But I want to ask something.
Okay, sure, please.
I think he raised a good point, but I don't think it's the problem of like knowing about the cost and knowing about benefits. Because like when technology came up, like phones, I don't think people knew how beneficial they could be. And I don't think they knew like everything about it. But if you like show them, like somebody had to like study it, you know, and show them how beneficial it is and how to use it. Like maybe he was pointing out on companies, maybe, I know in Norway, the government imposed like, gave the subsidy to the electric car companies, such as Tesla, because the only problem these companies had was that they're expensive, so people would not buy them. But after the subsidies, they became cheaper, so people start to use it more and more.
Right, so this is the argument the environmental groups have used to argue for a revenue positive carbon tax. Because their argument is that a lot of technologies are expensive, but if we achieve what is called economies of scale, mass production, the cost will fall. And that's the reason why solar now actually in terms of installed capacities in most parts of the world is actually cheaper than coal. And that's why in terms of incremental capacity that is being added, solar in some parts of the world has overtaken coal. But solar had to survive, had to be subsidized for a period of time. And industry after industry, we have evidence that in the initial phase it's high cost. So high cost has to be kind of recouped some way. Either you sell a premium product and the rich pay, or the government pays. So there is a case to be made for subsidization of renewable technologies so that mass production starts happening and the cost falls rapidly and the market takes over. So it's a very tough call. One of the problems is that people are uncomfortable when the government picks the winners and the losers. The trust in government in Scandinavia is a very different type than trust in government in the United States. This is essentially a libertarian country, and there is a deep skepticism of the government. It's a funny kind of relationship. It's a love and hate relationship. So people will hold the sign that keep the government off my Medicare. So there is a kind of false consciousness in place, but there is a case to be made for aggressive subsidies to bring down the cost of certain renewables. Absolutely.
And also, as you said, there was the major concern in 2016 was the climate change, but in 2018 it was health issues. Do you think that's related?
Right. So the ad we showed, they are trying to relate climate change to health issues. And at the margin, it is being done, but it's not the main message. It's still saving Mother Earth. So we are still caught in the Mother Earth narrative. And that's why people can't relate to climate change at a personal level. But you're right, if we start framing it as a health issue more aggressively, then things might change. But that would require a change in mindset and a change in vocabulary on how the environmental advocates, the environmental movements start thinking about their communication strategies. Yeah.
Have you identified any strategies for educating people who are not receptive to these ideas?
So it's Cornell's question that how do we persuade Republicans? And I think the answer is the same. Climate change has become a taboo word. It's a highly partisan word. So my sense is if you're talking with your friends who have a different political inclinations, first is try to find areas of agreement. So my neighbors are Republicans. They're rabid Trump supporters, but they're the nicest people. And I'm great friends with them. And they're not racist. They talk to me, right? They're not racist. Absolutely. I've got no problems in talking with them. But what we do is we try to focus on areas of agreement. When my neighbor Randy starts off on an anti-Hillary rant, I just smile. I don't push back. After 5 minutes, he's exhausted. He started to provoke me. I haven't got provoked. We start talking something else. And in August, when there was smoke, I said, Randy, what's all this stuff? He said, these damn environmentalists. I said, what? They started the fire. He said, no, but they don't allow forests to be managed well. And there's a point there. I think we need more aggressive forest management. And that is not happening for X, Y, or Z reasons. So it's not that climate skeptics or Republicans are always wrong. Maybe they have a point. That has to find areas of commonality. And we have to make the effort. We don't make the effort. We are quite happy living in our echo chambers and feeling good for ourselves. And social media has accentuated that problem severely. So what I would say, just do one thing. Whenever you are talking climate change with a person who you think has a different perspective, first of all, don't get aggressive about climate change and don't talk down. Try to understand their perspective and try to see if there's a way forward. But how should this be done? And I think that's a good way to start a conversation. It may not bring out policy change immediately, but at least you're talking. Now you stop talking, which really scares me. Nick.
So I guess I want to ask a question about the limitations of the policies that have been implemented and how that's been used against them. So for example, we know, or at least it's been suggested, there was a recent report I think last year from the Climate Major Project or something like that, and their conclusion was that since the late 80s, something like 100 companies have produced 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So we know that big corporate firms are the major contributors to greenhouse gas pollution, and then we design these policies where the costs of controlling carbon pollution can be passed down to consumers who obviously, I mean, behavior aside, don't feel, and I would say have some justification for not feeling like they're the major contributors to climate change. And I'm wondering if you think that that's a failure of the policy itself, that we've sort of designed them to be open to that attack, and how we could address that.
So you're right, a lot of Fortune 500 companies have become quite aggressive on climate issues. And some of the major examples are the high-tech companies. All the companies that are in the cloud business is extremely energy intensive. But all major companies have now pledged to rely significantly, if not totally, on renewable energy. In fact, the reason states like Ohio have flipped in favor of wind energy is that Amazon is setting up cloud computing centers there, and K6 realized that if they want to attract Amazon and the high-paying jobs, this is before the parade for the HQ2, they need to have aggressive renewable portfolio standards, so that actors have incentive to set up wind farms, the wind energy, and supply to Amazon. In fact, there was a bill in Ohio legislature that sought to kill that provision, and Kasich actually vetoed it. So in some ways, firms are far ahead of us. But eventually, if you break down, okay, what's the source of greenhouse gas emissions, household, transportation, blah, 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 blah. You realize eventually it's things like, housing, residential heating. And the Green Deal is talking about retrofitting buildings, and I think that's an outstanding idea. It also creates local jobs. It will get blue-collar workers on the climate bandwagon because there are concrete jobs for them. Of course, how to retrofit may have a carbon footprint, but you don't have perfect solutions. So I think there is a way out. Instead of telling consumers all the time that they'll have to bear higher costs, there is what I call a low-hanging fruit to be picked. But we are kind of caught in this paradox of perfect solution. We don't want to compromise, and we have this climate ideal that by 2030 it will be completely renewable. It cannot be. It's utter nonsense. And you're just scaring people away by making those kinds of claims. So I think there's a lack of political maturity and unwillingness to read the tea leaves and kind of modify your message accordingly, so that we don't scare away people with higher costs, and yet we are able to create a momentum, at least in certain areas, that we make even more rapid progress on climate change. And you're right, companies are much more sensitive, because a lot of companies, in spite of all the caricature, actually have a long-term perspective, and they want to be here for the long run. And with the pressure from institutional investors, I know a couple, situations where the companies have started taking climate change more seriously. Not everybody. There is a lot of pushback, but more than what we think are able to think about this. Similarly, the DoD, Department of Defense, they have released a couple of reports in the last couple of years, even under Trump administration, where they're saying major military bases are under threat. Virginia Beach Hampton Road, which houses the American Atlantic Field, during high tide, people can't access the naval base. There is 2-foot water. So there is a big concern in lots of actors who feel that their business models will not work. And Department of Defense is one of those actors. They have a long-term perspective. And that's why they are willing to defy the commander-in-chief and say, no, climate change is a problem for American defense capabilities.
So we have time for one more question.
I'd love to have you factor in the early economic argument that you pointed out, that much of this is a matter of indirect costs that come out of economic systems that do not, in fact, price their things in terms of the actual cost. And I'm just curious about much of what you talk about resistance seems to me at least partially to be exacerbated by growing economic inequality, especially since we're talking about the United States. In any way, any of the strategies that you think about in terms of coupling those more firmly, not just two ads in which one says cost and one says long-term gain, but rather making a clear sense that the the problems that the working class and the poor have in many ways are literally exacerbated by an economic system that allows indirect costs to eat them in many ways.
That's a great point. In fact, in France, that is what the anger is. That the president is giving tax cuts to the rich, but it's imposing carbon taxes on the poor. And rising income inequality and economic insecurity. What is amazing is it's a full employment economy. And still people are so insecure about economics. One would find this kind of a reactionary behavior during periods of high unemployment when people are worried. If it was 2000, 2008, one would have said, yeah, people are worried. But now we have a full employment economy. And yet, because inequality and a short shadow of the future is making people very economically insecure. So one is that we need to junk the system and create a new one. That's the Green New Deal. I don't think it will work. Because what is happening is already climate change is so polarizing. If you add more polarizing issues, there are too many veto points. So my thinking is that we should start small. Make some progress, build some trust, and then become a bit more ambitious. Because Green New Deal was enacted in a very different time period where there was an economic crisis, the existing models were completely failing, and Roosevelt had a bold new plan which had actually been tried by Governor Al Smith in the state of New York. People think it was a brilliant idea that FDR dreamt from nowhere. No, that's not true. Robert Caro has written a beautiful trilogy on this subject, and it's very interesting that in Governor Al Smith, the first Catholic to become the governor of a major U.S. and the first Catholic to get presidential nomination, was a very progressive person in terms of labor laws, in terms of this law and that law, and even in terms of environmentalism. The first state parks were built in the state of New York, the Long Island parks. So FDR had a template to draw on, and that's what he drew on. So I think we need to start small and focus first on climate emergencies so that people don't think that climate change has become a power grab. Under the pretext of climate change, we want to do social engineering. And I also think the proponents have to use their language more carefully. I think there is this, 1 second of glory on Twitter and people make all sorts of statements. The latest one being the Berlin Wall, which is completely historically incorrect. And I think that has come to, we are complicating the climate issues by layering it with other issues. I would prefer climate change, at least in the short run, as we move forward, we start getting some traction, remains climate change, and then we start adding other issues. Except, I think we need to talk about just transition, so that people who are hurt by climate policy know that they are not being thrown to wolves, and there is a social safety net that will help them to make a transition to a more secure and more affordable future.
Okay, well, this has been a fascinating discussion. Unfortunately, our time is up. And we have a gift for you. So it's very climate friendly, by the way. So we have some Foley wine. We give the students lectures decanters and crystal glasses as well. Let me thank all of you for coming out tonight. This was a really fabulous, interesting discussion. Join me now in thanking Professor Prakash.